Good evening. Thank you for tuning in and following us in our study in the parables of Jesus. We're going to be looking at two parables today, so let's get right into it. One is from Luke chapter 7, and the second one will be from Matthew 18. Matthew 18's parable is a little bit longer, a little fuller, so we're going to look at that one last. But that doesn't mean we're not going to get something from Luke chapter 7 in the parable that we find there. It's actually a really good teaching, and both teachings go hand in hand because the teachings cover the topic of forgiveness. I don't know about you. I don't know how you have handled forgiveness in your past. I don't know how you're handling forgiveness right now. For me, forgiveness is always something that I think on a conscious level I say that I'm good with, that I'm really quick to forgive people. But I think what I tend to do is sweep things under the rug, push them off to the side, ignore them, and just try to forget about them. And never actually deal with what's going on in my heart. And why I say that is because later I can usually hold those things against that person. I will usually, the view of that person will be tainted by the things they have done in their past. So that lets me know I'm not truly forgiving somebody. So hopefully this is going to be a good study for both you and I, and that we can fully comprehend God's forgiveness and how that forgiveness should be reflected in our lives. So Luke chapter 7 is our first parable, and let's get into it. The parable comes from verses 41 through 43. It's pretty short, so let's read it together. I'm reading from the ESV. A certain moneylender had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. When they could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. Now, which one of them will love him more? Pretty straightforward, right? I think the teaching is right there on the surface. We know who would love the lender more, is the person who had the greater debt that was forgiven. Jesus is actually posing this parable to an individual as well. And the individual gets it right off the bat. He says, hey, it's the person who owes the lender more. And Jesus responds and says, you're exactly right. So we know we've got the point of the parable. But I think the parable gains a lot more traction when we look at the context in which it's sitting in, which the context really begins in verse 36. Jesus has entered the home of a Pharisee. We later learn that this Pharisee's name is Simon, and he comes in to eat and apparently is not greeted well. We've talked about that in first century Palestine and really the first century world. Hospitality was a big thing. When someone came to your house, it was your job to treat them as the honored guest. And that meant a lot more back then than it does now. You had certain things that were expected of you as a host. And it would range from things as announcing that person when they came into the room to washing that person's feet, to all sorts of things, making sure that they had the correct seat at the table. You as a host had to treat your guests in a very specific way. Well, Jesus apparently wasn't treated to any of these hospitable acts. And while that, you might say, well, it's Jesus. He should be humble. He shouldn't care. Well, it just goes to show how Simon truly felt towards Jesus. He didn't really see Jesus as King and Lord. He was simply doing something for show, having a special guest, having someone that was really well known in the community to his dinner would have looked really good for Simon. Simon didn't actually care who Jesus was. Simon didn't love Jesus in his heart. So, what goes on after this is that a woman enters the room, and we don't get the woman's name. We only hear that she is a sinner. Some people have proposed that this is Mary or even Mary Magdalene, and that might be true. What we get here is in Matthew, Mark, and John is a very similar account of Jesus being in the home of Simon the leper and a woman named Mary coming and anointing Jesus' feet with perfume and drying his feet off with her hair. While these all four accounts could be the same, I'm just going to go ahead and make the argument that this is actually a different episode. And I say that because of this is the only one that contains the parable and the teaching of forgiveness. And thirdly, Jesus ends both accounts with a different purpose for what just happened. In Matthew, Mark, and John, Jesus says that the woman did this to prepare him for his burial. But in this account, that's not the point. The point is clearly to issue this forgiveness to the woman. So I think this might actually be something that happened earlier on in Jesus' ministry, while the Matthew, Mark, and John account all happened towards the end of his ministry. Again, Not a big deal. It's not something that's going to hurt doctrine in any way, but we can see that there's great parallels between these stories, and I think this one is actually something that happened at a different point. So the woman comes in, anoints his feet, and everyone kind of gets mad, and they start accusing Jesus that he's not actually a prophet. Because if he was a prophet, aka a man of God, he would have known that this woman is a sinner, and he would have not allowed her to touch him, because that would have been a very taboo thing to do for a righteous man, is to have an unclean woman touch him. So that concludes the background to the parable. Let's get into the details of the parable. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight just 3 phrases in these 3 verses. Actually, it ends up being 4 verses that I would like us to focus on. And we don't really get it from our English versions. You really only see it in the Greek. So I'm going to say what it sounds like in the Greek, in English, but you may not know this. So English is a very subject, verb, object kind of language. I want a shoe. Okay, so we have a subject, me, with a verb, want, and we have the object, the shoe. That's a basic English sentence. Greek does not obey any type of order like that. You can go object, verb, subject. You can go verb, which is most frequent, verb, subject, object. You can switch them all around. You can have multiple objects, multiple subjects, just like you could in English. But in the Greek, that gets more and more complicated. So I'm going to say what it sounds like in the Greek, as in I'm going to throw around the object and the verb and the subject, because that's important. In Greek, because they can do this in their sentencing and it still makes sense, a lot of times Greek authors will rearrange things for emphasis, and it's known as fronted for emphasis. When you put a particular part of the sentence at the beginning, the Greek author is trying to show you, hey, to me, this is what's most important in this dialogue. So it actually begins in verse 40. Our English version would read, Simon, I have something to say to you. In the Greek, it says, I have for you something to say. There's this emphasis of listen to me in this moment. I have something for you. I have something to ask from you. It's me. Listen to my words. There's this idea of Jesus being the prominent teacher in this moment, and everyone needs to have ears up listening to Jesus's next words. Simon is going to be the main point. It's not everyone that's in the room. It's I have for you, Simon, something to say. So even though there's a room full of people about to eat dinner together, Jesus is pointing out someone. And maybe that's because it doesn't really give us this in the text. It says that the Pharisees were saying to themselves, if he was a prophet, he would know. But apparently this was mostly directed towards Simon. 1, because he's the host. But 2, maybe his heart was the one most turned in the wrong direction. The one that was most tainted by this pride. And so Jesus is singling him out. The second phrase is going to come when we get down to verse 41. In English, especially the ESV, says, a certain moneylender had 2 debtors. Well, that gives you the idea that the moneylender is the subject of the parable. And I don't know if I've talked about this in recent videos, but a lot of times in parables, Jesus will put the subject of the parable at the very beginning. We notice this in the parable of the vineyard. But here he does the same thing. And in the Greek, it looks like 2 debtors were had by a moneylender. And so the debtors are the people that we should really be focused on. And so in focusing on them, we should focus on the debts that they owed. One owed 2 months' wages, which would have been equivalent to the 50 denarii. The other, 2 years' wages, noted by the 500 denarii. So let's pull this into American money. The U.S. average income, this is per individual, is $28,000. That might seem high to you, that might seem low to you, but the average is $28,000. So we would say someone who makes $28,000 a year, 2 months' wages would be $2,666 approximately. 2 years' wages would be, right, you just double the 28, $56,000. That's a lot of money. That's a big difference. Someone owing $2,600 and someone owing $56,000. But let's look at a household income. $53,000. Again, might seem low to you, might seem high to you, but that is the average household income, normally between two individuals, $53,000. So 2 months' income would be $8,833. 2 years' wages would be $106,000. So 3 times, 106,000, 3 times the highest average student loan debt in the U.S. is what this one individual owed. $106,000 compared to the $8,800. Now, I'm not saying the $8,800 isn't a lot of money. That's a lot of money to me. But one definitely owed a significant amount in comparison. So who's going to be most thankful when the person gets the $106,000 they owed forgiven, or the person who gets their $8,800 forgiven? Well, both are going to be extremely thankful. The one who owed the most, though, definitely more so. So the next point I would like to bring up is in verse 42. When they could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. Now, which one of them will they love more? In the Greek, that looks like they didn't have it to pay, either of them. He forgave them. I know it sounds really broken up, but look what's fronted. They didn't have it. There's no way of them obtaining it. There's no way they can have this amount of money to pay back their lender. They're unable to do anything in their poorness. And really what that should bring us back to is this teaching that Jesus probably gave very often, the Beatitudes. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 3, we have it recorded the one time. It's, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall inherit the earth." When you recognize you are unable to pay your debt, you are blessed. And only in those, under that circumstance, can you be forgiven. When you realize you're unable to do it, and Jesus is the only one who can forgive you. So maybe a short little exposition here on the teaching. My sin is no greater than yours. It's no greater than the person who lives on the other side of the world or the person sitting next to me. It's also no less than the person sitting next to me or the person on the other side of the room. Sin equals sin, in that they both need forgiven, and you and I can't do anything about it on our own. Jesus has the authority to forgive all sins. He does so without judgment, and that's the beauty of Jesus' grace. It comes without judgment, this forgiveness, even though he is the only one who has the right to judge. Okay, so our next parable is going to come from Matthew chapter 18, verses 23 through 35. That's a long section, so I'm going to have you read it real quick, and then we can jump into our teaching. So pause the video for a moment and read 23 through 25 of Matthew 18. And after you've done that, let's get into it. So this second parable of forgiveness comes off this long tirade of teaching. He's coming off teachings on how great the kingdom is, on temptation, on God's love for his children, on holding others accountable, as well as the presence and authority of Christ. It's a pretty big, long list of teachings, and he ends this list of teachings with this on forgiveness. Peter may be trying to refer to a rabbinic teaching that would have been prevalent during that time that said you only had to forgive a specific individual up to 3 times when they committed a premeditated, unrepentant act. And that might seem very genuine to you. That might be something that I wouldn't even do. If someone did a premeditated and then wouldn't repent, wouldn't ask for forgiveness when they did that thing, we would probably cut them off. We would say they don't belong with us. I don't want nothing to do with them if they're going to treat me bad in this way. What's Jesus saying here? What's Jesus' response to Peter? There's no limit. There's no limit to how many times you forgive somebody. So Peter throws up 7 times. I know that everyone else is saying 3, but I'll say 7. Peter may be trying to look good here for Jesus. Jesus responds by saying, no, it's more like 70 times 70. In the Greek, it's a little unclear there. It could either be that he's saying 70 times, which is a lot, or he could be saying 70 times 7, which is a lot. and might be hyperbolic for simply saying you don't stop forgiving. So if you read that parable, you know that it sounds somewhat similar to the parable we just read in Luke chapter 7. Two different servants in two different scenarios owe amounts that they are incapable of paying. The first servant is actually approached by his master, and the master says, "Hey, I'm going to throw you and your whole family into prison if you don't pay this back." And that might seem crazy because if they're all in prison, there's no way that the master can make back his money, but punishment has to be executed. And so the servant comes back and pleads, though. He says, "No, please don't. Please forgive me." And the master actually forgives him his debt. That's crazy. And that same servant goes out and looks for money from the people who owe him money. And when that servant that he approaches begs for forgiveness, he's not willing to forgive him. And I think, again, the meaning of that parable is really evident. If God is willing to forgive us, how are we not willing to forgive someone who sins against us? How are we willing to not let go and truly forgive to the point where we do not hold those sins against that person anymore? That's some tough teaching. Now, there is something that is brought out a little bit more than there is in the last passage, and that is what's owed. Now, if you'll notice, the first servant that is approached by his master owes him 10,000 talents. That's a crazy amount of money. So first off, 10,000 is the highest number you can express in the Greek language by only using one word. And so this is often used throughout all of Greek literature as a hyperbolic expression for a whole lot of money. And so we could say that this servant owed him a zillion talents. Maybe you can read that as you read the text. The servant owed the master a zillion talents, as if to say it's insurmountable. This 10,000 talents, a lot of commentators have added all this up. What does a talent look like? What would it be? 10,000 talents. 10,000 talents are equal to 200,000 years worth of wages. So it is hyperbole. There's no way that someone could, I wouldn't think, someone could ever owe an individual that much money. Nor would there be a master who's willing to continually lend out that amount of money, which could be something else to allegorize to God. God is willing to continue to give and give and give in hopes that we're going to do something with it, in hopes that we're going to be in service to him. But if we don't, he comes back to collect. So that might be a second teaching that's in here. But what we should focus on is the forgiveness aspect of the teaching, because I think that's what Jesus is trying to highlight. So the servant owes him a zillion talents. And the second servant doesn't owe him a little bit of money, owes him, how much does it say? 100 denarii. A denarii was approximately a day's wages. So 100 days worth of working. That's a lot of money to owe. Nothing compared to 200,000 years worth. And that's often what it looks like with you and me. We owe God so much for what he's done. And we want him to forgive. We beg for him to forgive. But when someone simply does us wrong, hurts us, hurts our family members, we can't forgive. This is really brought out in a lot of several YouTube videos that I've seen where it's a courtroom setting and you have the murderer, the one who has done wrong, that's sitting up here for questioning, and a family member will come up to the stand and actually forgive that person for what they've done, and actually go into this long, monologue of how much it hurt, the difficult process they had to go through in order to get to the point of forgiveness, but that they did forgive that person. That's what Jesus wants us to do. And a lot of times it's going to take us wrestling with our emotions. A lot of times it's going to take us crying and hurting to get to that point of forgiveness. Now, a lot of us will take time and cry and bemoan and, talk to as many people as we can about it just to get to a point of sweeping it under the rug or forgetting about it or deciding I'm cutting that person off. Rarely do we ever try to truly wrestle with this to get to the point of forgiveness. It's hard. I'm not saying it's not easy. But none of Jesus' commands are super easy. And this is one of them. A point that we can probably get out of this is that one's fellow disciples, other people who have submitted themselves to Christ, are representatives of Christ just as you are. They are no less, they're no greater. And just as Jesus wants to forgive you and wants to forgive them, he demands that you forgive each other. See, this is something to think about. You're not the only child of God, okay? We're all children of God. And God will avenge his children, each and every one of them. So that means if you have done wrong to your fellow disciple, God will still avenge them. And that vengeance will be brought down on you, as this parable lays out. The master hears that his servant did not forgive his servant. And so what happens to the first servant? He's thrown into prison. And he's going to have to be in prison until the debt's paid off. The 200,000 years worth of debt that he can't now get a job to pay off the debt. Do you see the predicament he's in? That's what you and I could possibly face if we're not willing to forgive our fellow disciples. This is a very community parable. It's about us looking around at one another as fellow disciples of Christ and willing to forgive at all costs. So, 3 things. These are 3 points that were brought out by a scholar that I really admire, Craig Keener. These are 3 points that he brought out. A disciple's forgiveness should be unlimited. The magnitude of God's saving grace is the proper model for forgiveness. Do you want to know how to forgive? Look to God. Think about what God has done for you. And the parable depicts the hubris of unforgiveness toward a fellow servant of Christ. We become really prideful. A lot of times really prideful after we know we've been forgiven. It's almost like we're walking on the clouds at that point and everyone else is below us. We have to be careful of what comes with forgiveness and that we don't build up pride within ourselves to the point where we don't forgive others. And a fourth, the parable depicts the consequences of human unforgiveness. When you and I do not forgive, when you and I are not willing to wrestle with, cry over, plead with God about forgiving our fellow disciples, there's consequences. Although God is long-suffering, although he has all the patience in the universe, although he desires all men to come to repentance, he has his limits. And this parable depicts that. This doesn't come at the end of times where the master comes to the servant. This happens right then and right there. He has his limits. If we do not conform to the will of God, we can get wrapped up in that. We can suffer at the hands of God's wrath. He's willing to forgive. We have to be repentant. In that repentance comes full forgiveness. I hope this has been a good study. I hope you'll really consider forgiveness. Maybe think about someone that you haven't been able to forgive. Say a prayer for them right now. I have found it's really hard to hate people and be mad at people when I pray for their well-being, when I pray for them to succeed, when I pray for them to do well in life. I have done that for enemies in my past, and it's actually really helped me come to true forgiveness. So I encourage you to do the same thing. I hope you're looking for ways to serve your neighbor and to love them in unexpected and in genuine ways. Continue to strive to serve God in everything that you do. Peace and love.